You watched a coworker miss the same deadline 3 months in a row, and nothing happened. No conversation, no write-up, no consequences. Then you missed one, and your manager pulled you aside before lunch. You've sat in meetings where everyone in the room knows someone isn't pulling their weight, and nobody says a word. Not your manager, not the team lead, nobody. Everyone just looks at their laptops. You've filed complaints that got a sympathetic look and a promise to look into it, and then you never heard another word. And then you watched a restructuring wipe out people who were actually holding the team together, while the person everyone avoids somehow kept their seat. And the part that made you question your own judgment was that nobody around you seemed confused by any of it. Like there was a rule everyone understood except you. There is a rule. You just weren't taught it. And the rule is this. Some employees aren't measured by how well they do their job. They're evaluated on one thing: whether getting rid of them would cost someone above them more than keeping them does. That's the distinction that reframes everything you've been watching. And once you see it, you'll understand why the person everyone complains about outlasted 3 rounds of cuts, why your complaint went nowhere, why you got scrutinized for things they get away with daily. Here's what was really going on every time you raised a concern. Somewhere above you, a leader did the math. Not the kind of math you'd expect. Not a performance review, not a fairness audit. A logistics equation. How many of their responsibilities land on my plate if they're gone? How long does it take to backfill? What falls through the cracks during the transition? And if the answers to those questions produced more headache than the original complaint, your concern got a polite nod, a note in a file, and a slow death by inaction. You thought you were flagging a performance issue. In practice, you were handing someone a problem and asking them to solve it on your behalf. And management doesn't solve problems unless ignoring them becomes more expensive than fixing them. The person you reported isn't being shielded because they're doing great work. They're being shielded because letting them go would require effort, documentation, legal review, and time from people who have already decided that living with the problem is the cheaper option. Here's the thing. The manager isn't loyal to that employee. They're loyal to their own calendar. That employee absorbs tasks the manager would otherwise have to own. They might handle those tasks badly, but they're still handling them. And if they're gone tomorrow, those tasks don't vanish into thin air. They land on someone's desk, and that someone is usually the manager. That's the real reason this person is untouchable. Not talent, not connections, just pure operational convenience. Now, here's the part most people miss entirely. That protected employee isn't just being tolerated. In a strange way, they're sometimes quietly preferred over you. And you've never understood how someone who delivers less, who visibly delivers less, gets treated with more patience than someone who delivers everything. The answer is uncomfortable, but it's consistent. Reliable employees create expectations, and unreliable employees collapse them. And once a manager has adjusted to low output from someone, they often find predictable dysfunction easier to manage than the pressure of holding everyone to a high standard. Think about what happens when you consistently perform at a level above what's required. You become the benchmark. You become what management assumes everyone should deliver, which means you've built a standard they now have to hold everyone else to or justify why they're letting it slide. But the underperformer has done the opposite. They've conditioned everyone around them to expect almost nothing, which means anything slightly above nothing registers as improvement. This is why managers lose patience with strong employees over minor errors while extending endless grace to someone who makes those same errors every single week. It's not favoritism, it's calibration. You set a high bar, so falling short of it triggers a reaction. They set a low bar, so clearing it by an inch triggers relief. You're being measured against the standard you built. They're being measured against the standard they were allowed to keep. And their standard is lower because nobody above them ever insisted it be anything else. Let me explain what this did to you over time, because you probably didn't notice it happening. At some point, you gave up waiting for the problem to get addressed. You started building around it. You picked up responsibilities that should have been theirs. You stopped assigning them anything that mattered because the risk was too high. You developed backup systems, contingency plans, entire workflows designed to function as though this person didn't exist. And you thought you were being professional, keeping things running, being the reliable one. But the reality is that you removed the very pressure that would have forced leadership to act. Every time you compensated for their failure, you made that failure invisible to the only people who had the authority to do something about it. The work still got done, the clients were still managed, the deadlines were still met. And since everything appeared functional on the surface, there was no crisis to justify intervention. You absorbed the cost so completely that from leadership's perspective, there was no cost. And that realization, when it finally hits, is one of the most disorienting moments in a person's career. Because what actually happened is that every late night, every extra task, every time you stayed to finish something they left incomplete, wasn't building your case. It was building theirs. Your competence wasn't being tracked as evidence that you deserved more. It was being consumed as proof that the current arrangement was working fine. You didn't just cover for them, you eliminated the evidence that would have forced their removal. And now you're carrying your job and a piece of theirs, while your title and your compensation reflect only one of them. And the cruelest part is that absorbing that extra load has become your new baseline. Pulling back from it now wouldn't look like fairness. It would look like you're slipping, which means you've made yourself essential in the worst possible way. Not essential because you're being groomed for something bigger, but essential because you're the person absorbing problems that nobody above you wants to deal with. You're not being invested in, you're being used as infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't get promoted, it gets maintained. Here's what nobody talks about. And this is the part that matters most. The protected employee doesn't just survive inside the organization. They reshape it. Once a leader has adapted to tolerating low performance from one person, their entire framework for evaluating the team begins to shift. They stop rewarding the people who push for better. They start rewarding the people who don't create friction. Predictability becomes more valuable than ambition. Silence gets treated as professionalism. Initiative starts looking like noise. And the protected employee is the one who taught them to see it that way, not through any deliberate strategy, but just by existing at a level of performance so low that the manager rebuilt their entire expectations around it. And you, the person who was pushing for improvement, for accountability, for things to actually function the way they should, you've become the disruption. Not because you did anything wrong, because you threatened the equilibrium they spent months constructing around the problem they chose not to fix. You've had moments where you flagged a legitimate concern and watched your manager's face tighten, like you were the issue for bringing it up. Where you proposed a better system and got pushback instead of interest. Where you asked for accountability and got told to stay focused on your own work. You assumed your manager was either oblivious or indifferent. The truth was simpler and worse. You wanted to fix something they'd made peace with months ago, and fixing it would have meant they had to absorb work they'd successfully offloaded onto you. Now, apply this to layoffs. When restructuring hits, leadership isn't reviewing performance data. They're asking one question about every name on the list. If this person disappears Monday morning, what breaks? The employee who cross-trained their peers, documented every process, and made their work easy to hand off scores low on that question. Their absence is manageable. Their contributions can be redistributed without operational panic. But the employee who hoarded knowledge, embedded themselves in workflows nobody else understands, and became a single point of failure for something critical, they score high. Not because they're more valuable, but because they're more entangled. And in a restructuring conversation, entangled beats excellent every single time. The people making those cuts aren't planning for next year. They're planning for next Monday, and the person whose absence would cause the most immediate pain gets to stay, regardless of whether they were actually any good at their job. You weren't kept or cut based on what you contributed. You were kept or cut based on how cleanly your responsibilities could be handed to someone else by Friday. That manager who kept someone terrible and let someone great walk away, they were managing their own calendar, not the team's output. That HR complaint that vanished, it was weighed against the hassle of following through, not whether you were right. That reorg that seemed to protect exactly the wrong people, it protected the people most embedded in systems nobody else could operate, not the people who actually built those systems. What looked like dysfunction was actually a machine running exactly the way it was designed to run, built to minimize leadership's workload, not to maximize the company's output. You've spent years wondering why competence didn't shield you, why effort didn't compound, why the people who deserved consequences never seemed to face them. And none of it was ever about fairness or merit or who deserved what. It was always about who generated problems for the people in charge and who made those problems disappear. The protected employee generated predictable problems that leadership learned to tune out. You generated solutions that leadership learned to lean on. And in an environment where avoiding effort matters more than rewarding it, the person who created less work for the people in charge will always have more protection than the person who created more value for the company. That coworker you've been watching coast for years isn't protected because nobody sees what they are. Everybody sees it, and they've always seen it. They just concluded that your quiet competence covering the gap was a cheaper solution than addressing it through proper channels. And every time you absorbed the extra load, every time you built a workaround, every time you held things together in spite of them, you weren't proving your value. You were protecting theirs.